Civil War and of World War II, I should see. Probably other wars as well.
Yes.
Any wars not? The Peloponnesian War?
Yeah, I don't go back that far. Most medieval, no. But
Okay,
yeah.
no Thermopylae.
I started 1775.
Not too many Civil War generals had a son who was a general in World War II. Okay, this might be the only one.
The MacArthurs.
Arthur?
Arthur and Douglas.
Was Arthur a general during the war, though?
No, he wasn't.
Oh, wow. Yep.
Yes. Fun piece of trivia, since we're on the topic. There have only been 3 officers in the history of the United States Army to be a general in 3 wars. Douglas MacArthur, Winfield Scott, and Lewis Hershey. In case you're wondering who the last one is, he ran the selective service in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
And obviously, you kept him out for his confidence.
I'm great at pub trivia.
Kentuckians. As you heard from the quiz, Simon Bolivar Buckner was not only Kentucky, but he had Chicago connections as well. We may hear something about that.
Oh, yes.
It's an amazing story, but Chris is currently the director at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison, Wisconsin. He received his BA from Emory and Henry, MA in Public History from State University of New York. It's been everywhere.
Pretty much.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, in National Park Service, various trusts, emerging Civil War. He's very active in the emerging Civil War blog, which one was follow. And I'm sure it's going to be a great presentation. And so, without any further ado, Chris Kolakowski.
Thank you, Bruce. It's great to be here tonight. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay. Okay. If at any point you cannot, just wave, and I will be more than happy to speak up. Hopefully I won't blow out the microphone that I have that you're recording me for. But it's great to be here. It's great to be here at one of the finest roundtables in the country, and one that has always been very near and dear to my heart. Some of you may remember, I know Mary, you remember this, way back in 2006, 2007, when I was at Perryville, Kentucky, which tomorrow is 20 years since I started that job. This roundtable gave me some essential money in my organization, some essential money to do some battlefield signs that are still up on the battlefield. So I've always, ever since then, the Civil War Roundtable of Chicago has had a special place in my heart. So it's wonderful to be here. And I'll just say thank you, first of all. But also it's wonderful to be here to share some great history with some great Civil War scholars and enthusiasts, as you all are. So I'm looking forward to a great discussion when we get done. I'm going to tell you right now, I use these slides for multiple presentations, and I realized last night when I put this up in Milwaukee, I forgot to change the title. So I'm going to apologize for that right off the bat. But what we're going to talk about tonight, I'll put that up as a subliminal advertisement for a while, because I do have copies of the book for sale. What we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to talk about, as it was mentioned earlier, a family that's kind of unique in the sense that you have a father who's very prominent in the Civil War, a son who is very prominent in the Second World War. And we're not just going to focus on the unique aspect of that. I want you to think about it in broader terms. I was talking with some folks before dinner tonight about how sometimes when you look at a great historical event through personal lenses, the lenses of people, it can illuminate in many ways. And one of the things that the story of Simon Bolivar Buckner Sr. and Jr. do is it illuminates, for the World War II generation, 1865 was 80 years before. Just like for us, 1945 is 80 years before. So they grew up, just like we have grown up with World War II veterans, just like 80 years later, there were still, for them, there were still GAR reunions that were going on. There were still Civil War veterans around. The Civil War is very much a part of that. And their parents and grandparents were the ones who fought the war, passed it on, and provided the inspiration and guidance for the World War II generation. I could give a whole talk up here about the different ways that the Civil War echoes through different World War II personalities, but I'm going to use the Buckners as our exemplars this evening. And so I want you to think about it, when we think about the legacy of the Civil War generation, we often think about what they did on the battlefield. We think about what they did afterwards. We often think about it in national terms, in economic, whatever terms you want. But we often forget this personal aspect. Because in many ways, to understand Buckner Jr., you have to start with Buckner Sr. And the last thing that I will point out to you is if you accept that one of the parents' greatest legacies is their children, this Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. is one of the legacies of the Civil War generation. Okay, so I want you to think about those things as we explore their story, because I think they're tremendous exemplars of those. Not to mention, they do some really interesting things in their respective lives. So our story starts April 1st, 1823 in Munfordville, Kentucky, where Simon Bolivar Buckner Sr. is born. His father was a War of 1812 veteran and had taken some of his property, or had taken some of his claim, and had set up a farm. And his second son, his first son is Lt. Buckner Jr., but his second son, he decides to pay tribute, one anti-monarchist fighter to another. Because remember what's happening in 1823 in South America. Simón Bolívar is overthrowing the Spanish Empire. And so this is one anti-monarchist's tribute to another. And so thus Simon Bolivar Buckner. And yes, they anglicize it. So it is Simon Bolivar Buckner. There's now 5 of them, with hopes of a 6th at some point. Simon Sr. goes to West Point, graduates in 1844. He's a tactics instructor, as we already heard. Goes to the Mexican War, serves with U.S. Grant. When Winfield Scott's army abandons or evacuates Mexico City at the end of the war, the officer of the day, the last day, is Simon Bolivar Buckner, and it is his honor to haul down the American flag and end the occupation. He comes back after the war, gets married, spent some time on the frontier, and then in the 1850s, after his father's death and also his wife's business interests around a little town you may have heard of, Chicago, Illinois, he decides that it's more lucrative to retire, to resign from the Army, and come and manage his business interests. And now, you may be wondering where the property is. Does anybody know where their property was? It's the Kingsbury Tract. The Kingsbury Tract. So if you get off the Kennedy on Ohio Drive, you go right down Ohio Drive, you cross the river, from there to the lake, you bisect their property, you cut it in half. It's there, yes. So when you know that, by the way, I'm going to tell you right now, what's that?
Kingsbury Street.
I love this because normally when I mention that or I've mentioned this description, even in Milwaukee last night, most people sort of kind of knew what I was talking about. I love being able to be in a Chicago audience and you all know exactly what I'm talking about. But when you know what part of the city that is, they did very okay for themselves. In 1857, we heard in the quiz about Buckner becoming a major in the Illinois militia. What the quiz didn't mention, he also becomes Adjutant General of Illinois for a short time, organizing the Illinois militia for a potential commitment to the Mormon expedition. And then has that for about 8 months and then resigns. In 1859, as sectional tensions are beginning to build, he decides that he has a great affinity for home, and he decides it's best if I go back to Kentucky. And his wife agrees with him. However, right before he leaves, he puts everything in his wife's name. Just in case something happens, he has legal protection. Takes him 10 years after the war to get it all back, but nonetheless, it prevents it from being confiscated. He might have wished, considering Chicago in the 1870s, we'll get there. Anyway, in 1861, he's the Adjutant General for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He's one of the very few officers I've ever come across who's an Adjutant General of 2 states. And he's head of the Kentucky State Militia, the Kentucky State Guard. When Kentucky becomes neutral, it's his job to protect the state. When Kentucky joins the Union and the State Guard fractures, Buckner has a choice to make. His deputy, Thomas Crittenden, whose dad is the senior U.S. Senator from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, stays loyal to the United States. And if you know anything about the campaigns of the Army of the Cumberland, which I know all of you do, Tommy Crittenden's name shows up very quickly. Buckner is offered a generalship commission by both President Jeff Davis and President Abraham Lincoln. He decides to go south. And so he'll leave Louisville and be given a command in central Kentucky, where he'll later move with some of his troops to Fort Donelson, where, as you all are very well aware, it is his lot to surrender the first complete Confederate army of the war on February 16, 1862, to his old friend U.S. Grant. And we heard in the quiz correctly some of the things that he did. Yes, it was a loan. Yes, Grant paid him back, by the way, just to clear that piece up from the quiz. Grant, actually, it's funny, if you read, he later told Buckner, he's like, I didn't know it was you. When I wrote all those really horrible, sharp messages, I thought I was talking to Floyd and Pillow, who, quite frankly, he hated. And actually, the first question when Buckner shows up to hand over his sword, where's Pillow? And Grant actually later said, had I known it was you, I would have acted differently. So you're welcome to make of that what you will, but I think it's a very interesting vignette. He's held at Fort Warren, Boston Harbor for several months. Grant had offered him, gold or whatever if you need some help to take care of you. Buckner said, I appreciate it, I'll be fine. He's released, comes back, joins Braxton Bragg's Army of the Mississippi, later Army of Tennessee, commands a division at the Battle of Perryville. And actually the signs you all funded cover his division's attack. So, another fun little fact for you. I don't normally get to throw into this speech. So, and then his health was never really that great over the war years, and his health breaks, and he has to take a leave from the Army of Tennessee before Stones River. That's when he's at Mobile, actually. He's commanding the defenses of Mobile. He'll come back to the Army in time to command a corps at Chickamauga in 1863. And then in 1864, Edmund Kirby Smith will grab him and take him out to the Trans-Mississippi, where he'll be Kirby Smith's chief of staff. Interestingly enough, Kirby Smith will not release Buckner when a general in Virginia requests his services. That general, Robert Edward Lee, who wants Buckner to command a corps. You're welcome to make that. That'll win you a bar bet one day. So Buckner's out there for 1864, 1865. He's surrendered the first complete Confederate army of the war. And now in May of 1865, when Edward Canby sends a note saying, hey, we should talk, the Confederacy is collapsing, it's Simon Bolivar Buckner that carries out the surrender of all the forces west of the Trans-Mississippi. So he surrenders the last major Confederate land force on the last major Confederate theater in North America. And at the end of the war, he is not permitted, the quiz was right about this, he is not permitted to go back to Kentucky for 3 years. So he settles in New Orleans, his family joins him. By this point, he's had a daughter, gets involved in newspapers, ends up moving back to Louisville, and also, in addition to getting involved in newspapers, becomes extremely active in politics. He becomes a Democratic delegate from Kentucky to the the Democratic conventions of 1868, 1872, and 1876. So he becomes very active in state politics, and very quickly, the man knows how to write and speak. And if you read any of his writings, if you read any of his newspapers of the 1870s, you see that that's the case. And he becomes a very prominent voice from politics, but also just as a commentator. But the 1870s are a very dark decade for him. The years after the war are very dark, and they only get darker as the 1860s pass into the 1870s. His wife dies in 1874. 1871, the Chicago fire destroys the Kingsbury Tract. And that, plus the Panic of 1873, forces him to divest his holdings here in Chicago. So, which is unfortunately a fairly typical thing for people in Chicago at the time. But if you go look at a map of the fire, the Kingsbury Tract is right there at ground zero. Anyway, so he basically retires to the family estate at Munfordville, Glen Lily, with his daughter. But she's in her early 20s and is an extremely eligible bachelorette. And within about a year or two, marries a guy from Louisville and moves away. So Buckner's there basically by himself, and it's a pretty dark time. That changes in the 1880s, where he meets a vivacious Richmond girl named Delia Claiborne. And they get married in 1885. And on their honeymoon, he goes and visits U.S. Grant at Mount McGregor while Grant's writing his memoirs. And it's actually an incredible, incredible moment. It's actually there where Grant admits to him, "I didn't know it was you at Donelson." At the end, Buckner knows what's about to happen. He sticks around New York to be a pallbearer at Grant's funeral. And a lot of people, a lot of newspapers note how it's just one of those symbols of reconciliation between blue and gray. Not just Buckner, but Joe Johnston as well. He comes back to Kentucky, and then in 1886, while he's thinking about running for governor, he has a son. July 18th, 1886, Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. is born. And from the moment that he takes his first breath, his life will have an unusual aspect. Because dad is 63, mom is 29. Yeah. Good genes in the family, I'll just leave it at that. He then lives his toddler years because dad gets elected governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky in 1887 and will serve from 1887 to 1891. He will live his toddler years in the governor's mansion in Frankfort, which is quite an interesting place for a toddler to run around, if you ask me, but here we are. And the Buckner governorship is extremely interesting. I'll just simply say this. Buckner was so rich that he was able to lend state money when the state treasurer absconded with the state treasury and literally disappeared. So it's not just an Illinois thing. Sorry, had to throw that in there. But that's a whole speech in and itself. But it's an extremely interesting governorship when his dad is governor in 1891. And at the end, when his term limited, when he comes out, he tries for the U.S. Senate, doesn't get it. But in 1896, as we heard from the quiz, is picked to be the vice presidential candidate for the Gold Democrats. Now, the Democratic Party, 1896 presidential election is one of the most divided presidential elections we've ever had. You had the Republican William McKinley. You had the Silver Democrats, which was monetary policy, but also prohibition. That's the other issue that divided the Democratic Party. And the famous Cross of Gold speech. When William Jennings Bryan gives the Cross of Gold speech, there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party that are like, we don't want anything to do with that guy. And so a couple of weeks later, they meet at Indianapolis, the Gold Democrats. They're also known as the Bourbon Democrats because they are not prohibitionists, quite the opposite. And they meet at Indianapolis and nominate Palmer and Buckner. Until last year, John Palmer was the oldest presidential nominee to run for president. Make of that what you will. So my footnote in the book is actually out of date, but I digress. They finished third, of course, but here's the other thing. At the convention, Buckner brings his wife and son, and 10-year-old Simon, or Bolivar as they all call him, becomes the star of the show. Everybody in the newspapers, everybody talks about this energetic, curious kid. He talks about later in his life, he's like, I remember going with my father to the courthouse to hear debates and to hear discussions, market day. We, just wanted to be active, very curious about the world, very friendly, very engaging. And he wins the hearts and minds of everybody. And the last day of the convention, they quickly write up a resolution and declare him the child of the democracy for the year 1896. I've never heard of that anywhere else. A newspaper reporter in 1943 reported that a good way to make General Buckner blush is to mention that title. Of course, as I mentioned, the campaign finishes third. By 1900, Simon Jr. is now 14, and his parents have been trying to broaden his horizon. He traveled all over the country, and in 1900, they go to Europe. They go and watch Kaiser Wilhelm II review his army. Buckner Sr. just gesticulates toward the Kaiser. That man is going to get his country in very serious trouble someday. And, well, if you know anything about the history of the 20th century, he was right. It's also about this time that Buckner Sr. performs what one of the greatest services a parent can do for a child, and that is to encourage their interests and provide an opportunity to explore a potential career field. Buckner Jr. is interested in following Dad to West Point. Now, here's where Dad's connections make a difference. Because Dad had supported McKinley, even though he was anti-Bryan. So if you're anti-Bryan, McKinley's people love you, even if you happen to have a D next to your name. He supported him again in 1900. And of course, who was the vice presidential nominee at the time? Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt becomes president upon McKinley's assassination. Roosevelt and Buckner had gotten to know each other, had really gotten to like each other. And every time that Buckner and his wife were in Washington, Buckner Sr. and his wife were in Washington, they'd stop by the White House and have a conversation. And it is through Dad's connection that Theodore Roosevelt appoints Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. to West Point in 1904. And so at the age of 17, he turns 18 1 month after he gets there. At the age of 17, he goes to West Point. And if you read the family letters, some of which I quote in my book, you can see how Dad is very much living vicariously through his son. And he's remembering, and he's sharing memories, and he's saying, keep an eye on this. And you can see the way that he is trying to give his son advice about how to go through West Point, which hasn't really changed all that much from his time to his son's time. And he gives him some very important piece of advice. And one of the pieces of advice he gives I find very revealing about Buckner Sr. and explains a lot of how he was able to survive all the trials and tribulations of his life to this point. Do your duty in whatever field it may lie, and never forget that you are a gentleman. He says that to his son. His son will say that to one of his sons when the third generation of Buckners will go to West Point, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Remember, do your duty in whatever field it may lie, and never forget that you are a gentleman. Think about that, and now think about Buckner's Civil War career, particularly the things that he had to deal with. It's extremely revealing, and you can see how he's passing it on to his son, that legacy we talked about. Buckner Jr. graduates from the class of 1908. He's in the middle of the class. He played football, he wrestled. He was quite a popular figure in many ways. And graduates and is assigned to the infantry and goes to the Philippines, where he engages in a very lively conversation with his parents. He's never seen anything like the Philippines. And his father, if you read the personal correspondence back and forth, his father's actually sending him books too, and things to read, and also giving him advice and encouragement and things like that. He comes back. In 1913, Buckner Jr. is among the Army officers that is assigned to support for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Because remember, the National Park Service didn't take that park until 1933. It was the Army that had it before. And he writes this amazing letter back to his parents. And he talks about what an incredible experience it was to be there among all these leading lights of the Army, and seeing the soldiers shake hands over the wall. You all have seen the pictures. You've heard those stories. He watched that. And he talks about this was a victory for peace. And then his mother writes a letter back that has been lost to history, but clearly had a raised eyebrow. Because, remember, she's from Richmond, right? And he's like, listen. He said, I want you to understand, I took this as a professional challenge as a student of history. And he says this, and this is very close to a quotation. Loving the South does not compel me to hate the North. Which I find to be a very interesting comment about where we are in terms of personal reconciliation, especially because at this point, Dad is the last surviving Confederate Lieutenant General, the last senior Confederate officer still alive. Okay? So you can think about that on the drive home, and you'll begin to unpack some of the layers of what's going on. Dad falls into a coma in 1914. His son is actually stationed at Fort Thomas, near Cincinnati. So he's able to be at his father's bedside when he falls into a coma on January 6, 1914, and 2 days later dies. His mother will live until 1932. She'll move away and go to Louisville. Buckner will then, after dealing with all that, will go and become assistant superintendent of buildings in Washington, D.C., where he meets a vivacious, Louisville-educated, New Orleans-born woman named Adele Blanc. And they will get married on the next to last day of 1916. When the United States enters World War I in 1917, Buckner Jr. is in the Philippines. And I forgot one thing. When Buckner had done his first tour in the Philippines, he had decided, he'd written a letter to his parents, and he told them, I want to make the Army my career. I love the Army, he said. And then he said this, and I want you to remember the advice that his father gave him. Buckner Jr.'s life philosophy is this: to render the greatest possible service to his government is the duty of every officer, and this should be his highest ambition. And when you think about what Dad had been advising him, what Buckner Sr. had been advising him, you see the echo of that in those words from 1911. So he's back in the Philippines in 1917 when the United States enters World War I. Day that happens, April 6, 1917, he writes a letter to Theodore Roosevelt saying, I hear you're forming a new Rough Riders. I hear you're forming an infantry division for the Western Front. I'm ready to go. The response comes back, you were down on my list, but the president won't send me. Of course, he's talking about Woodrow Wilson. So Buckner spends World War I stateside, training air cadets, and basically down in Texas. He was a crack shot, but he failed the eye exam for the Air Corps. And that enraged him quite a bit, as you can imagine. But anyway, he will be fated to spend World War I stateside. During this time, they start a family. They have 3 children, one in 1918, Simon III, Mary in 1922, and then William Claiborne, Bill Buckner, not that Bill Buckner. We were talking about that over dinner, so that's why I can get away with that.
Not that.
But William Claiborne, who's the one that goes to West Point, class of 1948, in 1926. Bill Buckner is alive. He's 99 years old. He's an active member of the Kansas City Civil War Roundtable. I spoke to them back in January in front of him and Simon IV. Wow. So, yeah. We think of the Civil War as being far away. It really isn't. And I'll just say this real quick. Without the assistance of the family, this book wouldn't have been possible. Anyway, at the end of the war, if you know anything about West Point, particularly West Point in the Civil War, you know that the Civil War wrecked West Point because they graduated all those classes early. And what you did was you destroyed the structure of the Corps of Cadets. The cadet command structure, the cadet ability to police themselves, and not only that, passing on the mentorship from senior to junior and so on down. The same thing happened in World War I. They started graduating classes after 2 years of instruction. In October 1918, they graduated a class, and then the armistice hit on November 11th, right? You're coming back. You are student officers, and you're going to graduate on time in 1919. How do you think that went over? The class of 1921 graduated 17 in the entire graduating class. That's the most since before the Mexican War, or the least since before the Mexican War. Okay? West Point is wrecked, absolutely wrecked. And Douglas MacArthur and a team of young officers are plucked to go and put the military academy back together. And one of those people is Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. Now, you heard in the quiz, and I'll mention this as well, whenever you see in any general's biography or any officer's biography, service as a tactics instructor at West Point, I want to make sure you understand what that really means. Not only are you instructing infantry tactics and military tactics, that's the obvious thing, but this also is the military mentors to the cadets. You have direct command authority over the cadets under the authority of the commandant. And particularly in Buckner's case, that included cadet discipline, included cadet mentorship, all those things that the upperclassmen who weren't there normally would do. Your TAC is your military exemplar as a cadet. It is your military mentor and is a fundamental part of the system at West Point. So if you ever see an officer instructing tactics at West Point, that's what it means. It is an incredibly responsible position that can ripple forward generations in the Army. Okay? And I just want to put that point out there. We talked about it in the quiz. I know there's other people that you probably have read about, but I want to make sure that's out there. That's what Buckner did for 4 years, was help put West Point back together. The modern West Point was birthed during that time, from 1919 to 1923. He then goes to the Command and General Staff College, does so well. Hey, we want you to stick around, be an instructor. Goes to the Army War College. Hey, you did so well. We want you to stick around and be an instructor. And then after that, he becomes Commandant of Cadets at West Point from 1932 to 1936. And among the people that are in that class of 1936, we heard a couple of them already. Westmoreland and Abrams, Bruce Palmer, Benjamin O. Davis Jr. are all in that class, among others. So it's a very interesting. William Westmoreland later credited Buckner for improving his diction, because Westmoreland showed up with a really horrible South Carolinian accent and did such a terrible job reading a July 4th proclamation that Buckner actually had him get speech classes. So make of that what you will. But you see the impact that he's having. You see the legacy, the ripple effect. And by that extension, what his father continues to have as well. Buckner will go on to a troop command. He'll go back to Gettysburg in 1938 for the 75th anniversary. He's commanding the 66th Infantry Light Tanks in the 75th anniversary celebration at Gettysburg. And if you've seen the photographs or seen newspaper accounts of the tanks that drive through town and go around the Lincoln Circle as part of the parade, in the lead tank is Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. It is not recorded what goes through his head, but you can only imagine. You can only imagine. War clouds are darkening around the world. And on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invade Poland. One of the reasons I'm here is that the Germans didn't stop at the border. My grandfather was in the Polish Army in 1939. 3.5 years in the Gulag via Britain, and I'm here, but I digress. There's a question. The United States needs to get far more serious about its defense than it has lately. And they need to fortify some of the outposts, particularly in the Pacific, where the Japanese are getting restive. And one of the places that they realize they need to fortify is Alaska, which has been a U.S. territory. Won't be a state till 1959, but it's a U.S. territory since 1869. The Alaska Peninsula is 900 miles wide, 800 miles deep. If you cut the state of Alaska in half, both halves are still larger, each larger than Texas. It is 20% the size of the lower 48 states. From the tip of the Aleutians over here to the other tip of Alaska over here is over 1,000 miles. Okay? At the time, we only had 400 people defending it, and one cannon, which was a muzzle loader Russian monument. And they were parked right down here, which was not much good for anybody. All the installations that you see here were built by Buckner and his team in about 1.5 years. Because even though they assigned Buckner, the War Department has realized we need to send troops, we need to send money, we need to send men. And so a lot of the Alaskan infrastructure that is still there today was built by Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. And modern Alaska owes a great debt to him. They really do. And they know it. They know it. By the way, for those of you scoring at home, Bruce's dad was stationed right here at Fort Richardson, which Buckner opened in the winter of 1940 and 1941. They built it from scratch. Wooden buildings, heated, and they lived under canvas for a while they were building the fort. An Alaskan winter. Yeah. One of Buckner's engineers, Benjamin Talley, later said that Buckner was given a 10-year project. He did it in 1.5 years. By December 7th, 1941, when a radio operator in Fairbanks hears a garbled report out of Hawaii about a bombing at Pearl Harbor, there are 22,000 Americans up here, plus about 24 aircraft. And Buckner sends a message the next day to the Washington and says, I stood at the airfield outside Anchorage, Elmendorf Air Force Base today, and watched the entire Alaskan Air Force take off, all 24 aircraft, and fly patrols down here in the Gulf of Alaska. Washington got the message and very quickly began to reinforce the Alaskan Air Force. The Japanese are eyeing Alaska as well, because on a map, if you look at it, it's a very short hop from the western part of the Aleutians here, 700 miles over to the northern part of Japan. What nobody talked about on the map, and what everybody will discover through very difficult, hard lessons, is there's a perpetual low that sits right here off the Alaskan coast. It is comparable, it has been compared to the Earth's equivalent to the red spot of Jupiter, which roils the Jupiter atmosphere. Which means this has some of the worst weather in the world. Fog, wind. There are islands out here that the wind is so intense there aren't any trees. The Japanese take Attu and Kiska in June of 1944, or 1942, at the same time as the Battle of Midway. It now becomes Buckner's job to evict them. This is the first time a foreign invader had touched U.S. soil since the War of 1812. And so Buckner, they will assemble, along with some naval forces, air forces, some ground units, particularly the 7th Infantry Division. They'll take Attu in May of 1943. The Japanese will evacuate Kiska. We won't notice that. And then we'll invade Kiska on August 15th, 1943. U.S.-Canadian operation. Everybody seen the movie The Devil's Brigade? What they don't tell you is the first battle of the Devil's Brigade was Kiska, before they go to Italy. And the only casualties we sustain are when we shoot at each other in the fog. But nonetheless, Alaska has been liberated. The war now moves on. But George Marshall in Washington doesn't forget Buckner. Because while the war is going on, while Alaska may be backwater of the war, there are much more active fronts. Here's the Pacific. Here's North America. Here's the Soviet Union, China, India. All the red is everything that the Japanese own. So here's the Japanese home islands, Philippines, Formosa, Taiwan today. Where I've got my circling with my cursor is Hawaii. Down here is Australia. Douglas MacArthur is moving up with his forces from Australia through New Guinea. His mission in life is to get back to the Philippines and avenge the defeats of 1942, which, by the way, if you want to know more, I know a pretty good book. Meanwhile, Chester Nimitz is moving his Central Pacific Drive, island hopping from Hawaii west toward the Philippines and the area around Philippines and Formosa. The battles in the Central Pacific are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they need a field army headquarters, and they need somebody that knows how to work with the Navy and knows how to work with the Air Force. And Marshall says the guy is sitting up in Anchorage. And so Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. in the summer of 1944 takes command of the newly formed 10th Army, which is what my pin is. Several of you have asked. That's what my pin is. He's immediately thrown into one of the great strategic debates of the Pacific War. As the two drives approach this area, the Philippines and Formosa, which objective do you take? Buckner is assigned the ground commander for an invasion of Formosa, but MacArthur, as you can imagine, is not interested in that. They'll actually have a debate at Pearl Harbor with Franklin Roosevelt. There'll be a lot of Sturm and Drang between the folks in Washington, between the folks in Honolulu, between the folks in Australia. Where should we go? What should we do? Ultimately, Buckner's the one who turns the whole thing. He says, look, I can do Formosa, but I need reinforcements. I need service units. I need service support units. We don't have right here. You have them, but they're on their way to Europe. And what's the global priority? Germany first. Are you going to stop or even slow down the war in Europe to take one island in the Pacific? Absolutely not. Buckner also points out, with the Philippine resistance, who have been waiting for us to come back, we don't have to worry about it. We can do the Philippines with what we have now. That turns the whole thing. And so we go back and liberate the Philippines. We are the only colonial power to get back to liberate our colonies before the end of the war. And if you want to know why the United States has a trusted position in Asia today, it is in large measure that we kept our promise here. That's a whole presentation for a whole other time, by the way. So MacArthur's going to land here in the Philippines and spend the rest of the war basically liberating the Philippine Islands. Meanwhile, Nimitz begins to turn his attention to seizing outposts in preparation for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, which everybody assumes is going to happen. And so that'll lead to the Battle of Iwo Jima right here, February, March of 1945. And Buckner's new assignment is to take Okinawa, which is right where I have my cursor, roughly right there. Okinawa is 62 miles long. At its narrowest point is 2 miles wide. At its widest point is 18 miles wide. It is mostly rolling terrain with plains right here in the center, heavily wooded, particularly and mountainous up here in the north. 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, 400 miles from Shanghai, 500 miles from Formosa. Even today, this is a highly strategic island in the Pacific. And if, God forbid, something happened in the Taiwan Straits, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on this island would be right in the front row. Something to keep in mind. It's also the closest objective to the Japanese home islands we have yet tried. It's also a prefecture of Japan. It's represented in the Japanese legislature. The way I always say it is, this is their Hawaii. Okay? Both sides understand that this is going to be a full dress rehearsal for the invasion of the Japanese home islands and conduct themselves accordingly. Buckner's Army, 183,000 soldiers and Marines, are going to land on the west coast here, April 1st, 1945. A couple of days before, the 77th Division will secure Karama-Redo right here for a fleet anchorage. The idea is push across the island. Should take them 2 weeks, they think. Phase 1, secure southern Okinawa. Phase 2, secure northern Okinawa. Phase 3, secure some offshore islands. That's the plan. The Japanese commander, Ushijima Mitsuru, who was one of the best Japanese army commanders we face in the entire war, realizes it's not a good idea to meet the Americans on the beaches because they have a tendency to bring along a very powerful fleet and a very powerful air force that can knock my troops out in the open. So I'm going to dig them all in down here in southern Okinawa and honeycomb this with caves and defenses and bleed the Americans on shore. And bleed them as much as I can. While that's happening, the Navy and the Air Force will be bleeding the fleet offshore. That's the Japanese strategy, such as it is. That also means that when the 10th Army comes ashore on April 1st, they meet almost no resistance. There's a soldier of the 7th Infantry Division that goes a few hundred yards inland, turns around, says to nobody in particular, I've already lived longer than I thought I would. By the way, there's 2 more indications in Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr.'s diary of his father's legacy and where his father and what's on his mind as he's about to command one of the largest invasions of the Pacific War. March 28, 1945. I finished reading the 3rd volume of Freeman's Lee's Lieutenants, which had just come out the year before. Remember the original publication date, 1942, 1943, 1944. I had just finished reading the 3rd volume of Lee's Lieutenants, Gettysburg to Appomattox, a tragic epitaph to a nobly defended cause. And then on April 1st, or March 31st, as he's about to go to bed on his command ship. Tomorrow is Easter Sunday, my father's birthday, and the day of my first battle in command. I hope that I shall be able to look back on it with the same degree of enthusiasm with which I anticipate it. Those 2 statements, those 2 short diary entries, speak to what we were talking about and how in many ways to understand the son, you have to understand the influence of the father. You have to understand the father. And you see it in those diary entries right there. I'm not sure what would be on my mind if I was about to lead 183,000 men ashore in a desperate battle. My father probably wouldn't be that far from my thoughts, but I don't know if I'd put it in a diary like that. I don't know if I'd be reading about the Civil War ahead of time, especially Gettysburg to Appomattox. But the fact that he is a powerful statement in itself and is worthy of reflection. They come ashore, push across the island. In 72 hours, they manage to get across the island what they thought was going to take them 2 weeks. At this point, Buckner decides to tell the Marines, go north and secure northern Okinawa. Activate Phase 2 now. Meanwhile, he tells the Army troops, turn south and let's find the Japanese. Within 2 weeks, northern Okinawa is secured. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army troops to the south begin to run into the Japanese defenses, and very quickly, as the commander down there will say, we'll have to blast them out yard by yard. And over the next few weeks, in fighting that will be more reminiscent of World War I in some respects, and that's not me saying it, that's the veterans of the campaign, they will begin to push south, assisted by air power and assisted by offshore bombardment. Battleships firing at hills with 14-inch guns. The heaviest artillery bombardment of the Pacific War is to assist one of the offensives right in this area here. It's extremely difficult fighting. And extremely bloody fighting, I might add. They develop what Buckner calls blowtorch and corkscrew tactics. How many of you have seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge? Great. You get a great depiction of both tactics in that movie. Because the Japanese are dug in caves, and a lot of times interlocking caves. Blowtorch is you use explosives to seal off the cave and suffocate the people inside. Wait, I got that backwards. Corkscrew, seal the cave, suffocate them. Blowtorch, you pour gasoline in there. And then you throw a grenade, you throw a satchel charge, you throw something in there, shoot a flame-throwing tank, doesn't matter. And you can imagine the rest of the effects. That is how we advance. It's an advance that's measured in yards, but nonetheless, we continue to push forward and push forward. The Japanese defenses are centered here at Shuri. We take Shuri on May 31st. By this point, of the 120,000 Japanese defenders, there's only about 30,000 of them left, and they retire to the southern part of the island, where 10th Army begins to pursue. They wanted to pursue faster, but Okinawa now gets an inch of rain a day from May 7th to May 31st. They are literally stuck in the mud, and Buckner expresses his frustration in his diary. June 18th, 1945, General Buckner comes to the command post of the 8th Marine Regiment to watch him go into action on Okinawa. He likes to do this. He likes to visit from the front, view from the front. Believes that a commander can sometimes get the best feel for the battle by being there himself. This is not uncommon for him. Here's the regimental commander. Here's some regimental staff. Here's General Buckner observing the 8th Marines attacking past this hill into the valley in front of him. He watches this for about an hour and then turns and says to nobody in particular, it's just afternoon, by the way, just after lunchtime, or just about lunchtime. Things are going so well here, I think I'll move on to another unit. Just at that moment, a Japanese artillery shell strikes that rock. The blast knocks everybody down. Marines are shaken, but they're relatively unscathed. But a piece of that coral has broken off, hit Buckner right in the chest. He begins to gasp for air and is immediately carried back behind the hill where the regimental surgeon starts to work on him. Buckner raises his hand to try and get somebody to help him stand up. And a Marine private named Harry Sarkeesian grabs his hand. And as Buckner gasps his last breaths of life, Harry Sarkeesian repeats the following: "You're going home, General. You're homeward bound. You're going home, General. You're homeward bound." And that is what Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. hears as he breathes his last. He is the senior American killed by enemy fire in all of World War II and in the entirety of the 20th century. The next time that we lose a 3-star general to enemy action, 9/11 at the Pentagon. He's buried in a 7th Infantry Division cemetery on Okinawa. My grandmother's brother, who was assigned to 10th Army headquarters, attended the funeral. And the battle goes on. Roy Geiger of the Marine Corps takes command of 10th Army, declares Okinawa secure. Joe Stilwell is flown out and it becomes the permanent commander of 10th Army, and he'll command it for the rest of the war. And then 10th Army is disbanded at the end of the war after the Japanese surrender. Okinawa, Buckner is one of 49,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, in the air, on the land, or in the water around the island. If you add psychological casualties, that is 76,000, which is the same number as the Battle of the Bulge. Of those 120,000 Japanese defenders, over 110,000 are killed. We take 7,000 prisoners, more than the rest of the Pacific War combined. Of 400,000 Okinawan civilians, 200,000 escaped to American lines. Of the remaining, 80,000 are killed in the battle. Caught up in the fighting, some of them jump off cliffs into the sea to escape the Americans, and all causes in between. When you consider that both sides believed, and I correctly believe this as well, Okinawa was a dress rehearsal for the invasion of Japan. It is a preview of hell. And to understand the decision to drop the atomic bomb, you must understand this battle, because it weighed on their minds. In fact, the day that Buckner was killed was the day that Harry Truman was having his first meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff to talk about a prospective invasion of Japan and casualty estimates and things like that. So, but that's a whole other talk for a whole other time. After the war, Adele Buckner, who receives her husband's medals for the Okinawa battle as next of kin, is given the same choice that every next of kin of an American service member killed overseas is given. This is a tradition that goes back to the Civil War. You are given a choice whether you want to leave your service member overseas for burial in an American cemetery, or the United States government will ship them home at government expense to a place of your choosing. Of the allies that we fought with in both world wars, we are the only large nation to do this. If you were in British service, you get killed on some godforsaken hill in Tunisia or somewhere remote. You're buried in the nearest British cemetery, which is probably in the same general area. You don't get this choice. It is this commitment that America makes to its dead that starts with the Civil War and continues. Now it's automatic. After World War II, they started making it automatic. But even so, that automatic guarantee says something as well. If you get killed overseas, you're automatically being sent home. That still says a lot. Anyway, you get the idea. Adele Buckner is given this choice, and she decides to bring her husband home to lay in a family plot next to his parents in Frankfort, Kentucky. Some of you may have been there. Mary, I'm sure you have been there. They are right near Daniel Boone's grave. They overlook Frankfort. You got a great view of the modern Kentucky State Capitol. And you know what I'm talking about. Absolutely beautiful view of the Kentucky River. And in February of 1949, Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. comes home. His wife will live until 1988 and now lies next to him as well. His epitaph is a soldier's epitaph. Commanding General of 10th U.S. Army, he was killed by enemy artillery fire, leading his troops to final victory. That is a soldier's epitaph, if ever there was one. So as I wrap up, and as we've covered a lot of ground, I've covered over 120 years of history in about 45 minutes. But as we come, I want to bring it back to where we first started. Is for the World War II generation, the Civil War was very recent. It was a source of inspiration, it was a source of guidance, and it was a source of education. And that source represents the legacy, one of the many legacies of the Civil War generation. We've used the Buckners here tonight as exemplars. To understand Buckner Jr., you've got to start with Buckner Sr. I could have done this with others that fought in the Second World War. Douglas MacArthur, George Patton heading the list. But there are others too. I just didn't have time to put the presentation together. But you get the idea. And so I would commend this thought to you, is when we think about the legacy of a generation, particularly the legacy of the Civil War generation, don't overlook this personal aspect, of which Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. and Sr. are exemplars. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm curious about Senior's decision to fight the Confederacy. Can you expound on that a little bit?
I am going to do exactly, when I got this question in Milwaukee last night, which coincidentally was also the first question, I'm going to do exactly what I did for them, is I'm going to read you what he said. This is what he said. He criticized the actions of the U.S. government. When citizens, this is his words, when citizens were arbitrarily arrested without warrant and imprisoned in remote fortresses without trial or charges on the will of one man, I considered it the right of every citizen to resist by force of arms these lawless encroachments upon the rights of free men. I therefore cast my lot with those who opposed these arbitrary assaults upon individual rights. That's his words. Make of it what you will.
It could have been written in 2025.
There are echoes to the present. I'll just leave it at that, Mary. Other questions?
Is that airfield
within bomber range of Japan?
Which one?
Okinawa.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, 350 miles? Yeah, they were already bombing from 1,500 miles away in the Marianas.
Very strategic.
Right. The reason that Okinawa was so valuable, it wasn't just the airfields. It's the port
Yeah,
and it's the bay right here because it's a fleet anchorage.
deep water.
It's deep water.
Logistics for the invasion.
Right. You can stage invasion troops. You can stage logistics through here. You can develop airfields. In fact, 8th Air Force was on its way to the Pacific when the war ends. And they and Bomber Command were going to take over the airfields right here for short range. Can you imagine that? B-17s and Lancasters at 350 miles. You can go multiple times a day at that range and bomb Japan.
Closer to the wall.
Yeah,
Closer to Saipan.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so you put, for those reasons, Okinawa is so important. It's a staging area.
Inspiration bombing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you look at the plans for the invasion of Japan, the air plan, I mean, it was going to be off the charts. It would have made Normandy look like just a
You said a million casualties?
a million casualties over several weeks. You got it. Every time I read about the invasion of Japan, I am so thankful that that battle was never fought. So, question in the back, and then I'll come up here to Bruce.
Real quick, what was his initial reaction when he found out he was going to Alaska? Was it like, why me, or the backwater place? I mean, he knew, obviously, he was important to Alaska, but did he feel that his talents could be used elsewhere besides Alaska at that moment in American history that World War II was creeping into the United States?
That's a great question. And actually, he viewed it as an opportunity.
Okay.
He was one of the first two in his class to make general, because the promotion to Alaska included a brigadier general star. And he liked the challenge, and he actually came to love Alaska. He bought property there. One of his last letters to his wife on her birthday, June 14th, 1945, he concludes by saying, "May our next flag raising be in Anchorage." Because after the war, he was planning to retire in Alaska. He ended up loving the place, and he relished the professional challenge of getting Alaska ready. He was not a dumb guy. He also knew that this was a prominent opportunity. If you think about the Army in the Pacific in 1940 and 41, there are three main outposts for the Army in the Pacific: Panama Canal, Alaska, and the Philippines. The Navy is responsible for Hawaii, Wake, and Guam. So if you're an Army officer, this is a pretty decent assignment to be handed in 1940. And he viewed it realistically, but he also saw it as an opportunity, relished the challenge, for sure. Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
You mentioned that Buckner Sr. put the Chicago property in his wife's name.
Yes.
Did the wife go south with him, or did she stay in Chicago to protect her interests?
She actually went south. She appointed one of her brothers, I believe it was, as guardian, but she went south and stayed south throughout the war, which created a legal complication after the war, because then it's like, well, the thing you were trying to avoid by putting it in your wife's name, because she went south, you actually didn't quite sidestep it as neatly as you thought. But they're ultimately able to get everything restored in a series of court cases in the late 1860s and early 1870s. And like I said, it was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, because by the time that's all settled, the Chicago fire has happened and the Panic of 1873 is happening, and it's time to sell. It's time to get out. So, and he gets out of Illinois. Yeah.
What did he think of Chicago and Illinois?
What did he think? He enjoyed it up here. He liked it up here. The reason he left was the sectional tensions. If you dislike a place, you don't join the militia or become the adjutant general of a state. So, he seemed to be pretty good. The thing was, the family split. And for those who've been to Antietam, the 11th Connecticut, the Kingsbury that's killed at Burnside Bridge, is Buckner Sr.'s nephew-in-law. So the family split during the Civil War, and they never, from what I can tell, never quite put it back together. And so that changes things. So when you ask, what did he think of Illinois, there's a pre-1861 answer, and there's a post-1865 answer, especially because of the court cases and things like that. But from what I can tell, he enjoyed Chicago, liked being up here, liked the opportunities. But obviously, life pulled him in another direction. Well, I got some books up here for sale. Thanks, everybody. Come on to Madison and see us.
Chris has a little memento of your stay
Oh,
here.
thank you. Awesome.
Get some of that good